This is an exclusive presentation of the Foreign Press Association.
This is Ian Williams for the Foreign Press Association in New York. And today we're speaking to Duncan Matthews, who's in London at the moment. He's a professor at Queen Mary College, specializes in intellectual property law, and has been studying how this is applied to the WHO negotiations. And I don't want to mischaracterize it, but since we journalists are supposed to have a talent for headline writing, the gist is that in between all of the comments about China and the UN, the White House's well-known antipathy to international organizations in general, and the WHO and China in particular, there is a very tangible economic reason that has, how do you say, obsessed American negotiators, which is the possibility that the WHO resolution and the gist of the WHO is that if people discover a cure for COVID-19 or discover a vaccine, then it should be shared. There are people who think that it should be kept in the patent vaults of whichever pharmaceutical company discovers it, especially if it's an American pharmaceutical company. Is that a fair summary, Duncan?
Yeah, that's a good starting point, Ian. Thank you.
So we've just had the World Health Assembly resolution. And of course, the headlines were about the attempt to get in Taiwan, which I think Taiwan actually dropped after a while when they saw that it wasn't getting as much traction as they'd hoped. We saw the effort of bashing China, deservedly or not, on the part of the US. And then there's the whole question of whether the WHO is fit for purpose. So within all of these parameters, where does your orbit take you?
Well, I think I'll take it as the starting point, Ian. The way that this resolution started off, it was a proposal by the EU on April 15, and the EU tabled a proposal for a COVID-19 response to the World Health Organization. So this was the zero draft resolution text. This was the negotiating document. It was immediately co-sponsored by over 40 World Health Organization members, including China, but excluding the US. And just a week ago, on May 19th, the resolution was adopted by a consensus at the World Health Assembly, as you've indicated. So it was a consensus document. All 194 members adopted it, including the US. So let me start off by saying what happened between those two critical dates, between April 15, when the EU made its proposal, and May 19, when the resolution was adopted. Of course, there were a series of consultation sessions within the WHO. And the starting point was that zero draft from the EU. And then delegations were working towards consensus language. Now, what was happening in those closed sessions was huge tension between the US and China. And it was really palpable, for everyone online, that there was this tension apparent. And the US was repeatedly proposing language in the resolution, which referred to the transparency and sharing of information. So this was a tacit reference. It didn't refer explicitly to the sharing of information transparency on the part of China, but that was certainly how it was perceived by the Chinese delegation. I'll come back perhaps later in our discussion and talk more about kind of the interdependency in the pharmaceutical sector between China and the US. But the end of the story in terms of the resolution was that within minutes of the unanimous adoption of the COVID-19 response resolution, the US then immediately disassociated itself with key sections of that agreement. Now, part of this was in relation to abortion rights, which the US opposed reference to sexual reproduction treatments in the final text. But the other reason was about the fact that the US opposed the language, as you've indicated, Ian, already, about what we call TRIPS flexibilities. And that's the fact that in the World Trade Organization agreement on IP, the TRIPS agreement, there are what we call inbuilt flexibilities. So these flexibilities mean that if there's a national health emergency, any WTO country can set aside the rights of a patent, for example, during a global pandemic, and issue what we call a compulsory license. So those powers already exist for WTO members by virtue of the TRIPS agreement. And in recent weeks, in response to COVID-19, what we've seen is countries like Germany and Canada, Ecuador and Brazil and others strengthening their national laws on exactly this provision, this so-called compulsory license to set aside patents on any respirators or treatments or any potential vaccines in the future, that they would have the ability to set aside those patent rights for the duration of the pandemic.
You mentioned in our conversations yesterday that in preparation that the US did precisely this over the anti-anthrax medications at the time of 9/11, but it seems to have slipped the collective memory in Washington now.
Yeah, that's precisely the case. Yes, after 9/11, people who are online will recall that there were anthrax attacks in the US postal system. And the best drug for treating symptoms of anthrax at the time was a drug called ciprofloxacin. And the patent was owned by a German pharma company called Bayer. And the US federal government, together with the Canadian federal government, both threatened Bayer with a compulsory license if they didn't, first of all, reduce the price, and secondly, start to manufacture in larger quantities. So, at the time, that led the WTO to what we call the Doha Declaration from 2001, that this was something which should be ring-fenced to sort of a TRIPS flexibility. But you're right that apart from that instance, after the anthrax attacks and what happened at the WTO to have a declaration on the existence of these flexibilities, the US is fairly consistently, through the Clinton administration, the Bush administrations, Obama, through all those US administrations, the US has consistently opposed discussing IP in other Geneva multilateral fora, such as the WHO. Their argument is that these are matters to be dealt with at the WTO. These are trade-related matters that should only be dealt with by the WTO. So that was kind of what was driving the logic of the US.
If I can put in a flip aside, at the moment, the White House seems to be deciding that closing down the US Postal Service is one way to solve the problem of anthrax in the mail.
Okay. Yeah. So what the US has said a week ago when it disassociated it with this reference to the language of TRIPS flexibilities, which essentially means compulsory licensing and other measures which can set aside patents and other IP rights when you've got a national health emergency. The US has said that it's concerned about misinterpretation of the language of TRIPS flexibilities. But on the other hand, these are legally permissible mechanisms which already exist in international law. So, countries are entitled to use these mechanisms, whether or not the US disassociates itself with the language in the World Health Assembly resolution or not. For me, it seems to be an example of sort of a rational irrationality, because on the one hand, the US is distancing itself from parts of the resolution. But as you said yourself, on the other hand, the US has used exactly these types of measures itself, in the relatively recent past. But of course, what the US is arguing is that it's necessary to avoid using these types of mechanisms to set aside IP rights, because if you do that, companies won't invest without IPR protection, because there'll be no economic incentives for them because their inventions will simply be taken away. And for me, at the WHO and other Geneva-based institutions, coming back to China for a minute, it seems that it's actually China that's winning the public relations war at the moment. Because President Xi at the World Health Assembly a week ago started off by saying that if a vaccine was invented in China, that it would be available for worldwide at low cost. And that very much runs counter to some of the news stories that have been popping up with Sanofi in France.
Well, that's the US attempt to buy Sanofi's
and they were
vaccine in advance.
Exactly, buying and there were previous news stories of the Trump administration allegedly approaching a German company called CureVac and offering $1 billion if the vaccine, which is being worked on by CureVac, would be exclusively for the use of the United States. So
are they making some offers in London now to Oxford, is it, for rights to a vaccine development?
Yeah, the Oxford one is complicated by the fact that this is the one that's been promoted now by the UK government. Oxford University,
which is so successful at the moment,
with AstraZeneca. But it's subsequently transpired that the US has been funding this research at an earlier stage with Oxford University. So again, there are doubts about if and when a vaccine is available, who will have the priority rights to that. And when I talk to family and friends, the discussions are not about when the vaccine will be available. I think what people are concerned about generally is once the vaccine has come on stream, who will be the first to get it? Will it be
Dominic Cummings?
The rich nations only that get it first. So it's about access, not just about the existence of the vaccine, but will people actually be able to get it? So this is very bound up with this discussion about something which on the face of it is quite technical, about the patent rights and the trade secrets and the data which is submitted to the FDA and other national medicines agencies. Will this information be pooled and be available as an open resource for society, given the state of the COVID-19 pandemic? And the other thing that China's been very effective at doing in the Geneva community is what we're hearing is that China's winning a lot of plaudits in Geneva because they're approaching delegations and offering small countries donations of the potential treatments, ventilators, PPE to help fight COVID-19. And the Chinese delegation really seems to understand that even small countries have one vote at the UN. So the positioning of China seems very, very deft, and we're definitely seeing a shift in the global politics as the result of how countries are responding in the UN institutions to COVID-19. So I think it's an interesting moment in kind of the international diplomacy and the role of China and the US.
One of the problems has always been that people see this in, and especially the United States, it seems at the moment, tend to see this in binary terms of it's the US versus China. So we have to make a choice one or the other. Whereas, a lot of people will say, well, yes, China was remiss in its handling of the epidemic to begin with. The WHO was probably at fault for not taking it more serious, not being more critical of China and the information they were getting. But the US was completely at fault for ignoring what the WHO said it eventually did. So everybody's calling each other names and there's mud to go around. But, what seems to be missing is some type of stepping back where people say, well, you're wrong and they're wrong. And can we work out what's right between us all? The discussions at WHO, they've been subsumed in the China row. You've introduced this element of, well, you haven't introduced, you have pointed out this element of the intellectual property rows that's underlying. So when it comes to Washington, which do you think? Obviously, it's a judgment call. Do you think they're mostly being impelled by support for the pharmaceutical sector, or is it really, or they're just and they're using the rest as just a weapon to bash China? Is there some sort of balance of motives that you could ascribe to all of this?
I mean, I think the response of the US to the World Health Assembly resolution, is entirely predictable. As I've indicated, it's sort of consistent with 25 years of US diplomacy on intellectual property. It's also consistent with the fact that, of course, the USTR produces in April every year its special 301 report with a list of priority watch countries. And essentially, when the USTR gathers the information about poor standards of IP enforcement in countries that the US trades with, the USTR sends out a request to pharma, which of course represents the research-based pharmaceutical industry in the US, and to other similar trade associations. So, I mean, I've written about this in some of my books in the past, that really the USTR relies entirely on information provided by industry. The statistics about infringement of IPRs and what's happening at the national level in countries is very much reliant on what the industry tells the USTR. So in that sense, there's sort of an element of influence which comes through the information channels. And of course, many of the large pharmaceutical companies also, make political donations, particularly to the Republican Party. And certainly when I've talked to lobbyists on K Street in DC, what I find actually quite refreshing is that in the US, they're quite open about the fact that pharmaceutical companies are making political donations to particular politicians. So it would only be expected that there is some level of influence for the range of reasons that I've just set out, Ian.
Well, we've come across American lobbies in Washington before on all of these issues. One of the questions that's just come up is that there's a suggestion about an anticoagulant from Italy. Did Italy discover this? And what will they do with the discovery? So I don't know whether this is beyond your expertise, but if you know anything about it.
I haven't seen that particular news story about an anticoagulant from Italy. Presumably, this is a potential treatment for COVID-19. I haven't seen that, but I think the general point is that your viewer raises is that, of course, this isn't simply an issue for the US to have to grapple with. We're seeing this as we discussed earlier, the Oxford University agreement with AstraZeneca, and one of the things that I've been asking is, well, can we see the agreement that Oxford University has signed to give an exclusive license to AstraZeneca? So generally, there's one of the problems in this field is the lack of transparency and the lack of information about who's going to own the intellectual property rights, who's going to demand royalties, who's going to be offered licensing agreements. So it just adds to, I think, the confusion and the uncertainty at such a fraught time of a global pandemic that we're in at the moment.
We can see from the reaction to Boris Johnson's advisor, Dominic Cunning, just how high emotions are about preferential treatment. Yes. So, the coming of any type of successful vaccine is going to be a highly socially divisive event. Who gets it first? Is it young people? Is it old people?
Yeah.
Is it politicians because they're so essential to the fight against COVID? Is it doctors? There's some form of, whatever happens, there's bound to be some form of triage while it comes in. And are there any agreements to cover that?
No, that there aren't agreements. And one of the issues of primary concern now in the US, and this comes back to our early discussion about relations with China, is that the US pharmaceutical industry relies to a large extent on China to produce what we call the active pharmaceutical ingredients. So what I'm saying is you can have a manufacturing facility in the United States, but to get what we call the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, to manufacture that product, US companies are to a large extent relying on China to manufacture the bit of the pharmaceutical which is going to be effective when it's used to treat a patient. And the estimates are disputed, but we think that about 40% of these APIs, which are used by the US pharmaceutical companies, are actually manufactured in China. The same.
India?
Sorry?
And the rest are made in India? What's it?
Yes, yeah, a large proportion made in India. But essentially, this is a global supply chain. And this is a decision which was made by the US pharmaceutical companies and by the global pharmaceutical companies in general. And it was a trend which has been driven over at least the last 15 years to have offshore manufacturing of these APIs because it's cheaper, they can lower their costs, because there are lower environmental standards in China. And the result is that, last year, in August of last year, the Pentagon actually issued a report expressing concerns about the United States reliance on these APIs coming from China and the fact that this could lead to a risk to the supply chain due to this so-called offshore manufacturing. So, of course, what's happening now is that the US is calling for the replacement of these offshore production of APIs. And there was a news story in the New York Times on May 18, reporting that the Trump administration is going to invest something like $350 million in a new company called Flow, spelled PHLOW, which is based in Richmond, Virginia, to try and build up the US manufacturing capacity.
Hold on, I thought one of the reasons why all this type of stuff was going on was because the US accused the Chinese of unfair state-fueled competition and investment in companies. Mm-hmm. So their response is for the US to fund an investment into countervailing state companies. There's more irony than there used to be in Pittsburgh about this situation.
Yeah. So as with all these things, there are different interests in every situation. So certainly the COVID-19 pandemic, has raised, as I suggested, debates which were already going on. The Pentagon highlighted this in August last year, also, we've spoken mainly so far about the research and development based US industry companies like Merck and Pfizer and AbbVie. But of course, the US also has a really strong generic industry, so drug companies which are manufacturing off-patent drugs. And a lot of these so-called generic companies are represented by a trade association called the Association for Accessible Medicines. And they haven't been slow off the mark because in the last couple of weeks, the generic industry have issued something called a blueprint for enhancing the security of the US pharmaceutical supply chain. And of course, what they're calling for is for federal investment in the generic sector, tax breaks, tax incentives, with the aim of leading to improved supply chains. And now the buzzword is that onshore manufacturing should be the model which replaces the offshore manufacturing that we've seen in the past few decades. But they haven't stopped there either. The Association for Accessible Medicines, the generic trade industry, are also arguing that the USTR should start negotiating with preferred countries, and they've even published a list of these preferred countries: Canada, Mexico, India, Israel, countries in Europe, but excluding China from that list, and that the new US coordinated supply chain for pharmaceuticals should bring in these preferred countries too. So coming back to our earlier discussion about which are the preferred individuals to get a vaccine, there are also, ongoing discussions right now about which country you live in might also determine your ability to access the US secured supply chain, which is being discussed in policy circles right now.
Yeah, it's we have. This is going to be a general trend, I suspect, after this crisis. There's going to be a return to autarky in the North Korean model, that if you make it yourself because you can't rely on anybody else.
Yeah,
which was in fact the sort of European model for food until recently, that we can't rely on the rest of the world, so we have to make sure our own food supplies is secure, and that seems to be sort of the growing pattern, but especially with the pharmaceuticals. What about the intellectual property part of this? Because the pharma companies have been very jealous of their intellectual property, and the US in general has been accusing the Chinese of filching patents and trademarks and counterfeiting stuff. So how can you stop this if you've been subcontracting your production to others? The patent is a piece of paper. Well, once people have got what's on the piece of paper in their heads or an electronic blueprint, this is how you make it. This is how penicillin got going. The British gave the penicillin patent away, or their rights to the patent, to the US to do with as they will during World War II. And bitterly have they regretted it ever since, I'm sure, but still.
Yeah, particularly with the more complex life sciences products which are coming on stream generally nowadays. Now, more than 50% of new pharmaceutical products which are brought on stream are not the kind of old-fashioned small molecule drugs such as aspirin or equivalent drugs which are made of chemical molecules. Most of the new drugs are things like Herceptin, the blockbuster drug for treating breast cancer. These are what we call biologic drugs, which are incredibly complex structures of proteins. So having the patent document, of course, with 18 months after you file a patent application, that document is published. It's public information, so you've disclosed that information. However, for these more complex biologic drugs, you also need the know-how about how to make the thing. It's not enough to have the patent disclosure. And what's been happening in China is that when companies are investing in China and setting up manufacturing facilities, companies are being asked to disclose the know-how, the trade secrets, as well as the actual patent information. So that's an interesting trend that I know the USTR and in Europe also, the authorities have been watching closely, that the Chinese are very keen to get access to the technical information about how you actually make these complex.
We're saying the Chinese here, but no one's going to convince me that the British, the Germans, and the Americans are not equally eager to get their hands on any such information if they get a chance to.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah, and this of course brings us back to to the situation in the current pandemic, because I mentioned earlier that Germany, for example, has just in the last couple of weeks made it much easier for federal government agencies to issue one of these compulsory licenses for a treatment or a vaccine to deal with COVID-19. But the German authorities will need the know-how as well. It won't be enough just to have the patent. It's likely that they'll need the trade secrets and manufacturing knowledge, given the complex nature of some of the advanced medicines that I've been talking about. So, again, this has been discussed a lot during the WHO negotiations, which we concluded last week, that let's not limit this to patents. there's been discussions about patent pools, that companies should be encouraged to share their patents. But it's also, as I indicated earlier, about the regulatory test data, such as is submitted to the FDA. Should rival companies be allowed to have that ready access to that information to demonstrate what we call bioequivalence? Our drug is the same as your originator product. Should companies be expected to share their trade secrets and their know-how about how to actually manufacture potential treatments and vaccines to COVID-19? So you're absolutely right that at a global level, these are issues which are being discussed as really being fundamental to sharing knowledge about how we can make available a potential vaccine for COVID-19.
I mean, looking at the UN though, and the various agencies, there's the World Trade Organization, there's the Intellectual Property Organization, and we have the WHO here. Which is the appropriate one? I mean, I would have thought, being a mere sort of civilian who's likely to die if I catch the COVID-19 from the profile, I would have thought that the WHO is the appropriate forum in which to negotiate this. But how much tension is there between the different jurisdiction shopping on the part of the various governments?
Perhaps I'll answer that part of your question second, but before I do that, I'd perhaps just like to sketch out a little bit the complexities of the Geneva UN architecture, because as you correctly say, within the UN umbrella, we've got WHO, we've got the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. We've got UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And in New York, we've got the United Nations Development Program. So there have been tensions in the past between the UN agencies about which of those agencies should be taking the lead on IP issues. So that's nothing new. In addition, as we've discussed already, outside of the UN architecture, we've also, since 1995, had the World Trade Organization. And it then starts to get very complicated because often if a UN issue is being discussed at the WTO, at the TRIPS Council, which is the committee of the WTO which deals with IP matters, the United Nations will often say, well, we're not going to discuss this because this is a UN treaty to which the US is not a party. And a classic example of this is the Convention on Biological Diversity. A lot of developing countries want to talk about traditional medicines and the IP rights which are being granted on traditional medicines, and whether that can be addressed under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which of course is a treaty administered by the UN Environment Programme based in Montreal in Canada. And the US says, sorry, US Congress didn't ratify that agreement, so we won't discuss it even at the WTO. So there's a long history of the complexity of international organizations and the different positions that countries have taken, depending on whether they've signed up to particular agreements of the UN architecture or the WTO. So within all this kind of international diplomacy, we have to try and navigate a way for a treatment or potential vaccine for COVID-19 to be accessible. But as we're discussing, it's a complex set of arrangements in international institutions that we have to work with.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a sort of six-sided sumo wrestling match, isn't it? They're all grunting and heaving to see who gets thrown out the dojo. Yeah. Large, immobile people. And, what's really missing here is a nuanced approach that balances the need to protect intellectual property, to how should we say, foment creativity. What the patents were originally for. It was to make sure that inventors got the benefit of their inventions.
Yeah.
I don't think that Benjamin Franklin and the other proponents of it at the beginning were really thinking in terms of large multinational companies amassing fortunes out of lucky flukes in their labs. But that's the background to it. But at the same time, we have these other issues, the public health issues. And is there any forum that's discussing this, that's reconciling it and saying, well, yes, you know, we can't have expensive drug prices in countries that can't afford food, let alone drugs. And at the same time, we have to make sure that the people who have put some money into developing this get some reward for it. And then there's the sort of what you might call the counterculture argument is these bastards are making far too much money. We've got to stop them.
Yeah, Ian, this has really been on the WTO agenda since the the anthrax incident that we talked about earlier in our chat. The Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement on Public Health from November 2001 led to a WTO decision on August 30, 2003. Then that led to a WTO further decision on IP and public health in December 2005. And finally, in January 2014, the first ever amendment to a WTO agreement was finally ratified to deal with exactly the type of issues that we've been talking about in relation to the compulsory licensing provisions that I mentioned earlier this afternoon. So, it hasn't really gone off the agenda. I think all that COVID-19 has done is just brought back to the public attention the tensions which exist, as you say, in the US Constitution, in Article 1 of the US Constitution, the right of citizens to benefit from the useful arts and inventions and creatorship. Thomas Jefferson wanted it right there in Article 1 of the American Constitution. And that's carried through. It's in the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights. It's in the 1966 UN Covenant, but also in those international instruments is not only the right to own and be rewarded for your intellectual property, but the right to enjoy health and to have access to healthcare facilities. And when you start to put those two set of rights together, that's when you get the tension. And I've written, and others have, about the fact that actually, if you start to create a hierarchy of rights, then the right to life is an inalienable human right. You can never take that away from a human being. And the right to access healthcare, including medicines, has to take preference over something which is, as you've said yourself, patents these days are generally granted to multinational corporations. They're temporary rights. A patent is only for 20 years from the date that you file your patent application. But on the other hand, there is a genuine desire to incentivize, the huge costs in new drug development. It costs billions of dollars to bring a new drug to market. The failure rate is incredible. And then you have to get it through FDA, the rigorous FDA approval procedures.
But this is where the suggestions that governments get involved come in, because it seems that, let's say, the target of a lot of these investments have not been where most people need them. It's where they think the most profits are likely to come. So it's been in expensive cancer treatments, which are, naturally only available in fairly wealthy countries where there's a pool of patients who are prepared to pay for them. It's not for sort of relatively common diseases in the third world. There was an exception for Ebola, because it looked as though if Ebola hit New York the way that COVID has, then it would even be more shocking than it is now in terms of the body count on the streets. So people, yes, they made an exception for Ebola, but in general, third world diseases that afflict most of the people, even TB, for example. TB is the far and away the biggest killer, I believe, in the world. and yet the amount of research on it is fairly minimal, because most of us in the north don't suffer from it, so it's not an issue. So this question of directed investment by the federal government and or the European governments is very important.
Yeah, and certainly over the last 15 years, the WHO has spent a lot of time discussing this in terms of public-private partnerships, that particularly for the neglected diseases in the developing world, such as Ebola, where there's effective no economic incentive to invest billions of dollars, because there's no market for an Ebola treatment commercially. That actually what you need is a partnership. You need public money, the expertise from the private sector, and you need to combine those to make publicly available affordable medicines. So I think, as the dust settles on COVID-19, these types of discussions about, further public funding to find a vaccine will become more prominent again. But these aren't new debates. As I said, they've been going on at least for the last 25 years, and finding a solution is not easy.
Well, getting back into the warm and comfortable embrace of the Middle Kingdom, do you foresee any future developments, controversies between China and the WHO and the US? What is the next step now this resolution has been passed?
Well, the resolution in its final form doesn't make explicit reference to the type of language that the US was proposing about transparency and sharing of information. So I think that particular discussion will continue, at least bilaterally, between the US and China. But I think what it's easy to forget is that there is this symbiotic relationship between the US and China in relation to pharmaceutical products. As I mentioned, 40% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients are coming from China. And even if a new system is set up, it's going to take years for the US to become, self-sufficient. So, it seems that, there are two possible things that can happen. Either we can have sort of a retreat to a new protectionist era with pharmaceutical products, or, we can have a new enlightened interdependence. And I think some of the rhetoric that's coming in the diplomacy is perhaps unhelpful to the reality. That the reality is we're all going to have to learn to get on and find a global solution to a global pandemic.
Yeah, that's certainly seems that way. But whether it's going to happen or not, I mean, you just have to look at that resolution and you can see there are touch-button issues on both sides. Like you cannot talk to the Chinese and mention Taiwan or Tibet, and you can't talk to the Americans and mention female reproductive health care, for example. They're both likely to lead to sort of mini nuclear explosions in diplomatic terms, not necessarily rational ones. And it's going to be hard times to negotiate over the months ahead. Are there any other questions? Because we've been grilling our guest for 40 minutes now and he deserves a break and a cup of tea or whatever. Any more? Speak, get your questions to Jonathan. Well, it looks like we should be moving on now. Duncan, thank you very much for an exposition of an essential part that's been overlooked in the strong and storm. I mean, you're right. I think that with a leap and a bound, Xi was free from being blamed for the epidemic. It looks like he's now the good guy with halo and little wings. Equally as undeserved as the devil's horns that he was given before, perhaps. But in PR terms, the Chinese have won on this one, I would say. Would you agree?
Yes. Before we wrap up, I'm seeing a couple of questions on screen that I'd like to try and address before we.
Oh yeah, please. Have you got them? Yes, I tried to paraphrase them, but they weren't that easy. Go ahead.
So this is a question from Mark Goldberg. Will the decisions of big pharma companies and the industry really be the dominating force over what will happen? Will the UN really be sort of a distraction? So, Mark, I think it really comes back to some of the general discussion that we've had. That I think the discussion about big pharma is a bit more nuanced. I think there are particular global pharmaceutical companies which are very outspoken about the need to protect their intellectual property rights. But what we're seeing on the ground now is such unprecedented collaboration between pharma companies. Often smaller biotech companies working in partnership with some of the the global household name companies. And I think that's where we're going to find the solution. It's through the collaboration between big pharma and the smaller specialist companies that are working on vaccines that's going to provide the breakthrough, and that's going to happen with public funding. So I think, Mark, to address your question directly, I think in a way the UN isn't going to provide the ultimate solution. I don't think it's a distraction. I think it helps to focus the minds, and it keeps this in the media. It keeps it in the public's attention, and I think that's important for politicians. That politicians perhaps don't often have long memories about what needs to be done for the public good, and the discussions at the UN level I think are helpful in keeping that focus.
My apologies to Mark. His question sort of snuck in on the corner of the screen, so I didn't see it while I was talking to you. Sorry, Mark. But I think it is getting to the end now, and we should wind up. I think you've given a masterful tour d'horizon here, and it's an issue that we will be returning to, all of us, whether we like it or not, because COVID-19 is going to be returning to us whether we like it or not. But the bigger issues are there as well. So I would say thank you, everybody. Thank you, Duncan, again. Thank you, audience. This is the Foreign Press Association of New York, and we've been having this press conference with Duncan Matthews, Professor of Intellectual Property at Queen Mary University in London, on the hidden background for the WHO China-US controversy. Thanks again, Duncan.
Thank you, Ian. Goodbye.
Thank you for joining us for this broadcast. To learn more about our digital forums and programs, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. For membership information, please visit www.foreignpressassociation.org and on Twitter at FPA New York. This has been an exclusive presentation of the Foreign Press Association.